Hello, I'm Linda Ross, Professor of Nursing.
And I'm Wilf McSherry, also a Professor of Nursing.
We'd like to welcome you to Unit 3, which is about planning effective spiritual interventions. And this unit relates to EPIC Competency 3 on the next slide.
So the area we're going to focus is in Competency 3, which addresses spiritual care, assessment and planning. And you can see from this definition that I wrote on spiritual assessment in 2010, that spiritual assessment is an attempt to inquire positively and unobtrusively with a patient or client. And it's about looking at areas of life associated with the general health and well-being. And I think the point being highlighted here is that spiritual assessment or any form of assessment shouldn't be obtrusive or intrusive. It's about sensitivity and dialogue. And there are different approaches to spiritual assessment, but these can be broken down broadly into two main approaches: formal or the active approach, and the informal or the passive approach. And I'll just explain this a little bit more. So what do we mean by that formal approach? And as this picture, this image suggests, it's like ticking a box. It's formal. We're seeking to actively elicit some information from that person. And this might involve the use of a spiritual assessment tool. It might inquire initially about a person's religious affiliation and practice. Do they have a personal belief, a spiritual belief, or a religious belief that's important to them? And how do we highlight that and document it and support that need? Usually this formal approach to assessment is undertaken on admission. The informal or the passive approach, it involves a combination of skills: our observation, our intuition. It's about interaction with that person in order to identify a need. And again, emphasis on dialogue. So it's integrated with that total plan of care. It's not a one-off activity, it's a continuous activity, as this next point emphasizes. And importantly, it can involve all members of the health care team, not one member of that team as a sole right or responsibility. This is a team approach. Some people might feel that this is the responsibility of the chaplain, but as we know from experience, some areas don't have chaplaincy, and some areas where there are chaplains, there aren't enough of them. So then by default, this falls to the responsibility of other healthcare professionals. There are a broad range of categorizations or approaches to spiritual assessment, and I'm not going to go through all of them. You can look at these in many of the texts of and articles that have been written around and books, chapters on this subject, which we'll signpost you to shortly. And this is just a flavour of some of the acronym-based approaches, and probably the most recognised is the FICA model produced by Pachalska and Roma in 2000. What we would like to highlight is that how do nurses, healthcare professionals identify spiritual needs? And it's clear from this slide that there are two primary approaches where this information is often elicited. First one is we dialogue, we talk to the patient themselves. And secondly, we listen and observe the responses that we're being given from the patient. And I think what's of note on this slide in particular is the point highlighted in red that formal spiritual assessment tools were only used by 3 participants in the RCN survey, which involved over 4,000 participants. So that I think tells us something significant about the use of formal spiritual assessment tools.
Because of that, and because of the time pressures and busyness of the clinical setting, that led us to question whether we can really expect nurses to be using yet another assessment tool on top of all the mandatory assessments that they have to conduct. For that reason, we decided it was appropriate to develop a simple tool, one that nurses can carry around with them in their minds and keep and apply in every care encounter with every patient at any moment in time. a tool that helps them to keep a person's spirituality at the center of everything they do. And we've named that tool the 2-question spiritual assessment model, or 2QSAM for short. The 2QSAM builds on Janice Clark's book, where she talks about spiritual care not being an extra thing we do as nurses, but rather integral to the care that we give. The 2QSAM centered on 2 simple questions: what's most important to you, and how can we help? Care as a result of that is spiritual, because it's based on and it focuses on what's most important to the person at any moment in time. It's truly person-centered and holistic. It gives permission for people to talk about some of the deeper things that might be bothering them, but they don't feel that they can voice. Care is dynamic and patient-led, and it's prudent. We only do what's necessary at any point in time, potentially saving time and resources. So how can that model actually work in practice? Well, we give an example of that in the article there on the left of your screen, The Power of 2 Simple Questions, where we apply the model to the last few weeks of my mother's life. And we cover some of the more tricky situations in which you might want to apply the model, say in caring for people with dementia, learning difficulties, or communication problems. We cover that in a chapter in the book on the right of the screen there. But for now, we'd like to invite you just to read that short article about its application in one setting. So staying with the idea of practice, we thought it would be interesting to listen to a short film clip, which we'll invite you to play by yourselves in your own time, and to listen to a stroke rehabilitation nurse talking about her care of Mr. C. So we'd invite you to listen to that film clip now.
Mr. C. He taught me that a person's spirituality is as individual as their fingerprint, and that the transcendent can appear in many different ways, and that sometimes just being a person with another person, rather than hiding behind our nursing title, can offer some comfort to the people that we look after. Mr. C's mobility had been affected by his stroke, and the likelihood of his returning to his previous level of fitness was poor. A member of the therapy team had noted that he seemed despondent during a session, and they were concerned that he seemed to be struggling with something. I went to see Mr. C and noted that he did indeed look reserved and troubled. I tried to start a conversation, and surprisingly, I didn't get very far with asking if he felt okay or if there was anything bothering him. I needed to find a way to connect. So I asked him about what he liked to do. And when he said that he'd been a keen hiker, I was able to express my own enthusiasm. We shared stories, and any concerns I had about rubbing salt in the wound were quickly gone as I saw him cheer and become more excited by the memories of his adventures. We eventually touched upon a most incredible moment. He described to me hiking in the Himalaya. So of course I'd asked him if he'd ever been near Everest, and then I watched as he was whisked away by his memory. He told me about the moment that he had hiked to the top of a valley and he looked up and he saw Everest gleaming in the sunlight. The Tibetans have strong spiritual ties to Everest and call her the goddess mother of the world. And just watching the expression on this man's face was enough to tell me that this had been a significant spiritual experience for him. He spoke about it with reverence, with a tear in his eye, and it was so clear that this was so much more than just seeing a mountain to him. Mr. C taught me that understanding someone's spirituality can help us to understand the struggles that they face. For him, his stroke had broken his connection with that which gave him meaning, and his connection with the transcendent. Whilst I couldn't fix that for him, it seemed to bring him some comfort to relive those memories, and it helped me to understand him more as a whole person. I hope that I have enhanced the care of my patients by attending to their spiritual needs. I had and still have much to learn about spirituality. Fortunately, I have some excellent teachers in the people who trust me to look after them. I have learned that we don't always have to understand or to be privy to spiritual conversations, but that knowing who to call for support is invaluable. I have been taught not to underestimate the power of connection and presence and the importance of supporting the relationships that matter to the person. And I have been shown that spirituality is not a one-size-fits-all, but that listening and being open with people can allow us insights into that which is important to them. Thank you.
This rehabilitation nurse doesn't ever actually mention the model itself, but the questions, what's most important and how can I help, are certainly at the centre of the care she gives. Just a few points to note from that clip. She takes a risk and she dares to raise the question of his climbing days. That gives him permission to talk about and relive what was most, and possibly still is, important to him. And we see some spiritual aspects in that clip that are to do with transcendence, about meaning and purpose of Mr. C's life, and about connecting him to nature, the significant and the sacred. This nurse makes a difference to Mr. C's care. And we can see here very clearly that spiritual care has made a difference. So just thinking about how the 2Q-SAM and EPIC, the EPIC standard are actually being used by other people. The 2Q-SAM's being used by specialist organ donation teams in the UK to help them with important and difficult end-of-life conversations they might be having with the families they're looking after. It's recommended, the 2Q-SAM's also recommended by the European Association of Palliative Care it's recommended as a tool to help all healthcare professionals to provide spiritual care as part of holistic patient care. And the EPIC standard in Wales is included in all our nursing midwifery education programmes, with our students being assessed on the 4 competencies throughout the 3 years of their studies. And the EPIC standard is also being used by over 23 universities in another 16 countries, putting spiritual care firmly on the map for nurse education and practice. So we hope that you find the 2Q-SAM and the EPIC standard, that those tools help you to plan effective and spiritual interventions. Thank you for listening.